Well, good afternoon. It is Thursday, March the 18th. Good to be with you today. We are continuing our devotional video series on Psalm 23 called Comfort from a Well-Worn Psalm. This is the 8th segment of this series, and we're going to be looking at verse 5. So there's 6 verses in total in Psalm 23. This is verse 5. And the first part of verse 5. And it says this: "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Well, it seems that the classic metaphor of a shepherd and sheep at this point in the psalm becomes insufficient to describe the richness of the relationship between the Lord and his people. So David shifts the metaphor to that of a host and guest. So that's the shift from the first 4 verses to now to verse 5 and verse 6. Now imagine with me, if you will, the following 2 scenes. The first one. The first scene is a medium-sized room. There's between 20 and 30 people, including yourself, that are seated around the perimeter of the room. You have all been invited to celebrate a close friend's birthday at their home, but other than knowing this friend well, nobody really knows each other. The refreshments sit in the middle of the room. People are munching on chips quietly in order not to stick out, because the room is already uncomfortably quiet. People kind of cautiously look around at each other, hoping not to be caught staring. But every once in a while, someone strikes up a conversation. But it only lasts for a few minutes. The volume level always stays at a minimum. People arrive to this gathering not knowing anybody. And, well, they leave not knowing anybody. That's scene 1. Here's the second scene. You've been invited to share in a very close relative's or friend's birthday at their home. You happen to arrive a little bit late, and upon entering the house, the volume of chatter hits you like a wall. And what do you see? You see those same 20 to 30 people crammed around a table, and they're sharing a meal together. There's laughter. Several conversations are going on at once. It's a lively atmosphere. Well, what's the difference between the 2 scenes? Well, I think there's nothing that creates community and fellowship better than having a sit down at the table meal together. I've experienced that many times where I didn't know anybody really at a gathering, but as soon as we would sit down for a meal, there was just something about sharing a meal together that really created a sense of a comfort level. Because, we all, of course, all like to eat. We all like to eat and talk. We like to talk and eat. Some of us talk so much we hardly ever eat. Perhaps you're one of those people. But having a meal together has that effect. Now, there was great importance placed upon families eating meals together among the different cultures in the Bible. And that still is the case for many of those same cultures today. For Jews in particular, every meal was a sacred event. It was a time when the family and very close friends would give thanks. It was a time of cherished fellowship with each other. Also, in addition to the importance of eating meals together as a family, in that custom for the Jews, a meal would customarily be shared between 2 people who had made a promise of some sort, a covenant with each other. Because having that meal together was seen as an expression of their bond of friendship and their trust. This importance upon meals helps shed some light on what David is saying when he says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." God had made a covenant with David after David became king of Israel. You can read that in 2 Samuel 7. So God makes this covenant with David, and David compares what God has promised to having a table that has been lavishly prepared. And David is sitting down as the host, down at this feast. God is the host. David is the guest of honor at the king's table. But it's certainly not a host-guest relationship that would be characterized as distant, but one of intimacy and close relationship. And though this table is in the presence of David's enemies, David says he feels very secure and protected. When a soldier is in the presence of his enemies and he has a meal, well, generally you would think that the meal would be eaten very quickly, hastily, not particularly enjoyed, just garbled down. But David is saying that he isn't hurried. There's no disturbance. Even that the enemy is kind of waiting at the door, he can eat in perfect peace, even in the midst of the most trying circumstances. And the table that has been prepared with God's best. And in using this table metaphor, God is saying, David, here's this lavishly prepared table. David, here's a dish I'm going to call, "I will make your name great." And then over here is called Israel's homestead, "No trespassers allowed." And here's one that you will like. It's called Rest. And here's another one, "Big plans for David's children and David's children's children." So to use that metaphor, God has prepared this lavish table for David with promises. Promises that would bless David for the future. And David loves this. David, of course, comments this in this psalm. And then there's also one other dish that perhaps you might want to put on that table. You might want to call that the royal house. That's kind of the house where David would come into God's kingdom, where it would be established forever and ever. Now think back to David declaring with confidence earlier in the psalm, "I shall not want, and I will not fear any evil." Right? We covered those two phrases earlier on. Well, think of it now in the context of verse 5. He's sitting at this table, lavishly prepared in front of his enemies. He's got everything he needs. So it kind of is just, it affirms what he's just said. "I shall not want." And he also says, "I will fear no evil," even if the enemy is there. So we see a connection in this psalm to this verse. Well, we have, if we were to apply this verse to us, we have even more reason to confidently declare, "I shall not want and I will fear no evil," because of this passage. Because we have the great shepherd who has laid down his life for us and has been raised from the dead, putting to shame our last greatest enemy, death itself. Jesus now stands as our host of this great feast. He's the King who has gone before us to prepare a place for us in his Father's house. And so whether our present path takes us through green pastures or by still waters, or whether it kind of snakes through the darkness of the valley, we can be confident in this, that Jesus has promised to welcome us into his kingdom on the last day, there to feast at his table, along with all his saints from many nations. What a celebration awaits all of us. The Lord bless you, and we will see you next week. Take care.